In her recent American Historical Association presidential address, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich examined a single torn quilt from 1857 to extract a complex tale of American frontier life. By subjecting a single patchwork of colors, shapes, and designs to microscopic historical analysis, Ulrich revealed cultural forces, social categories, and political ideals not typically seen in the contours of a faded hand-me-down quilt, including the struggles between Mormons and the federal government, marriage, sexuality, and gender roles, and religion, and ultimately the aspirations and contradictions embedded in the history of the American Republic. Sometimes the best way to approach a big topic is to focus on a small one, Ulrich concluded. I too would like to approach several big topics, the nature of freedom, race relations, and law in antebellum Virginia, by focusing on a single historical artifact. In this case, a law passed by the Virginia legislature allowing free blacks to enslave themselves. Although Ulrich's quilt ultimately revealed information global in scale and significance, an investigation into the text of Virginia's so-called voluntary enslavement law, a political tapestry as intricately woven as Ulrich's quilt, reveals a story far smaller in scale, the dilemma of two free black men in rural Southside Virginia and their complicated interactions with their local white community. Virginia in the 1850s is frequently and accurately described by scholars as the home of pro-slavery fire-eaters, emerging Southern nationalists, and a group of radicals bent on enslaving or deporting free blacks in their midst. The Voluntary Enslavement Law of 1856 often serves in histories of the period as a symbol of the most repressive acts passed by the legislature in the years leading up to the Civil War, as an attempt to facilitate the wholesale enslavement of the state's free black population. Indeed, Virginia's voluntary enslavement law inspired similar measures in 6 additional states in subsequent years: Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, and Maryland, all of which fueled the national debate over slavery. The text of the 1856 law, however, belies the traditional interpretation of the measure and admonishes the scholar of 19th century freedom and society to look beyond the act to how and why it was written and passed, as well as how and why it was then applied in everyday situations after its passage. The genealogy of Virginia's self-enslavement law illuminates the measure's unlikely roots, the efforts of Andrew and Willis Doswell, 2 brothers liberated by the will of their deceased owner in Lunenburg County. The law that they helped to create did not signify a general attempt by the Virginia legislature to enslave its free black population. Instead, Willis and Andrew Doswell's law served as a kind of protective measure of last resort for individual free blacks against one of the harshest laws on Virginia's books. No black person emancipated after May 1st, 1806 could remain in Virginia for more than 1 year after his or her liberation without facing arrest and sale as an absolute slave by local authorities. Though the expulsion law of 1806 was only sporadically enforced and rarely applied by local courts to their free black populations, it was prosecuted diligently enough that eventual conviction loomed as a real possibility. In Lunenburg County, only 5 individuals were formally charged for violating the expulsion law from 1843 to 1865, 2 of those individuals being Willis and Andrew Doswell in 1850. William Arvin Sr., a 70-year-old planter who offered evidence against Willis and Andrew Doswell in court in 1850, lived next door to the brothers since their emancipation in 1842. Arvin, like many of the county's whites, held complicated, ambivalent attitudes towards his free black neighbors. After all, Arvin had not reported the Doswells to the court for 8 years. Moreover, when offering evidence against the Doswells, Arvin failed to implicate the dozens of other free blacks who lived around him also in flagrant violation of the law. Though the Doswells stand out as clear examples of how Virginia law could constrict the lives of the state's free blacks, their case also reminds us how exceptional they were, how rare it was for their white neighbors, even those who might be most hostile, to use the law of 1806 against free black individuals. Willis and Andrew Doswell quickly sought the help of a local lawyer and unsuccessfully petitioned the county court for permission to remain in the state. The Doswells failed to appear in court to answer charges against them, and Lunenburg officials were duty-bound to act under the indictment that had been brought against the Doswells, but they did so sluggishly. Nearly 1 year went by before Willis and Andrew sought the aid of William Doswell, nephew of their former master and the man who owned the land on which they lived, who petitioned the General Assembly in Richmond to pass a special law that would allow the brothers to remain at home in Lunenburg. William Doswell, or someone assisting him, crafted an elegant letter signed by 47 neighbors, which testified to the impeccable character of the Doswell brothers, and explained why they should not be required to leave the state, as the law would have them do. William Doswell carefully chose language that might win over even those legislators who believed that free blacks as a group were, quote, morally and economically unfit for freedom among whites, and needed to be expelled from the state, as some white Virginians would have it. Doswell assured lawmakers that Willis and Andrew would live under his care if they were allowed to remain in Virginia, and he assured them that the pair would not, quote, move about drinking and getting drunk, as is usual with free Negroes, but to attend chiefly to their trade, the carpenter's business. The petition appealed also to lawmakers' humane impulses and pride as Virginians. Willis and Andrew Doswell wanted to remain in the Old Dominion, quote, rather than go to the northern or northwestern free states, believing from what they can learn this condition would be worse than in this state, and fearing that their situation in Liberia would be still worse, fearing the consequence of ill health or loss of life in going or acclimating. William Doswell's petition sought to exploit the conflicted views of Virginia's elite, who professed no doubt that blacks as a class were morally and economically unsuited to live as free people in Virginia, but many of whom also acknowledged that individual Afro-Virginians might be peaceful, honest, and industrious. Doswell's petition joined a larger chorus of opinion among Virginia lawmakers in the 1840s and 1850s over the sanctity of freedom, even for those on the bottom rung of free society. But William Doswell's appeal to legislators in Richmond had nothing to do with the Lunenburg Circuit Court, which continued to issue new summonses. The court had now been handling their case for nearly 2 years. Determined to remain in their communities, Willis and Andrew Doswell adopted a new tactic. They would ask permission to remain at home as slaves, provided they could select William Doswell as their new master. Perhaps that change in their legal status would allow them to continue living in the house that they had constructed on Doswell's property, practicing their trade as carpenters, all in their home community to which they belonged. Elsewhere, I describe in detail how the prototype for the South's first self-enslavement law in the mid-19th century slowly came about. It took 2 more years of legislative wrangling for lawmakers to agree upon the wording of Willis and Andrew's law, which would provide the template for a general self-enslavement measure 2 years later, in 1856. Virginia lawmakers of different persuasions all got something that they had wanted in Willis and Andrew's law. The Act's language reflected the complex and even contradictory impulses that guided legislators who reported to white male constituents who embraced a broad spectrum of opinions. Divided into 6 sections, the law was a labyrinth. First, Willis and Andrew were only allowed to enslave themselves to a relative of their former owner, a victory for those who saw little harm to the institution of slavery in allowing individuals to select new owners from whites whom they knew well. In addition, the Doswells could apply for self-enslavement directly to the county court of Lunenburg, expressing in a written petition signed by each man their desire to become enslaved.